Iran just announced it will close the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point where a massive share of the world's oil has to pass. And almost at the same time, China signaled a hard retaliation move, tightening and moving toward cutting off rare earths and key components to the United States, directly linked to Washington's detention of Venezuela's president, with a blunt message underneath it: release him immediately. This isn't diplomatic tension anymore. This is a crisis recipe. Energy gets strangled, supply chains get squeezed, and politics gets pushed into a corner where backing down looks impossible. If the sides don't sit down fast, the world could be staring at a shock that spreads with unusual speed. Not because bombs are falling everywhere, but because the core systems of the global economy are being switched off. Start with Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane, it's an artery. The moment traders believe the flow might be disrupted, even partially, oil doesn't rise like a normal commodity. It jumps like a fear asset. And in energy markets, prices aren't driven by what has already happened. They're driven by what might happen next. You don't need a full shutdown. You only need uncertainty. Uncertainty makes ships hesitate. Hesitation scrambles schedules. Scrambled schedules force stockpiling. Stockpiling lifts prices. Higher prices trigger panic. Panic triggers political reaction. And that loop can run at terrifying speed. But this time, what makes it far more dangerous is the second punch: China. If Hormuz is a global energy shock, rare earths and critical components are a shock to the industrial spine of the United States. Rare earths aren't some niche story about obscure metals. They sit inside permanent magnets, motors, advanced electronics, defense systems, EV drivetrains, wind turbines, the quiet upstream inputs that modern economies treat as always available until they suddenly aren't. Components work the same way. You don't notice them until they disappear. So when Beijing moves to restrict those flows to the U.S. in response to Venezuela, the strategic message is simple and brutal. If the U.S. uses force to threaten China's discounted oil access in Venezuela, China will use supply chains to raise the cost of breathing for the U.S. Because for Beijing, Venezuela isn't just a regime or a regional headline. It's a node in the energy system, a place where China can secure discounted barrels, diversify supply, and reduce dependence on routes and channels Washington can pressure. So if Washington flips the table in Venezuela, it hits something core: energy security and industrial security. That's why the response doesn't stay at the level of words. It moves to switches. Now step back and look at the combined picture. When a country gets hit simultaneously on energy inputs and industrial inputs, the global economy doesn't adjust smoothly. It gets squeezed from both sides. One side makes everything more expensive to run: fuel, shipping, chemicals, fertilizers, logistics. The other side makes everything more expensive to build: components, magnets, specialized materials, spare parts, equipment. This is not the familiar inflation story. People spent too much. This is the scarier kind. Inflation because the real economy becomes harder to supply. And supply-driven inflation is the kind governments hate most because there's no quick button to press. You can't ask consumers to behave and make oil cheaper. You can't deliver a tough speech and make components reappear. You either absorb it, negotiate it away, or escalate it. And that's where U.S. interest rates become the third fuse. Trump can want a low-rate era to juice growth, pump confidence, and market an economic win. But if oil spikes and industrial inputs get choked, U.S. inflation pressure snaps back like a spring. And once inflation snaps back, the Federal Reserve doesn't get to relax. The Fed lives on credibility. Lose credibility, and the bond market reacts before the data does. Yields rise. Credit spreads widen. Borrowing costs jump. Mortgages stay high. Small business credit tightens. Corporate refinancing gets harder. And if the Fed cuts aggressively while energy inflation is surging, markets read it one way: monetary policy has become political. Stability is being traded for a short-term headline. That's how expectations unanchor. That's how long-term costs stay elevated. That's how volatility becomes a permanent tax. So the low rates dream collides with the physics of energy-driven inflation. And physics always wins. That's why the Hormuz lever matters more than any single battlefield headline. Because it turns geopolitics into a direct hit on the cost of living. And once geopolitics becomes the cost of living, voters don't debate foreign policy. They demand pain relief. At that point, leaders either negotiate or they double down and gamble. Now add the cinematic twist that makes this feel like a thriller. Why would the world pressure Washington to release Venezuela's president? Because they understand the system logic. This isn't only about Venezuela. This is about global stability. If Washington holds him, it turns Venezuela into a symbolic victory. But symbolic victories trigger real-world chain reactions. Hormuz pressure lifts oil and pushes global inflation higher. China's rare earth and component squeeze lifts manufacturing costs and pushes goods inflation higher. Other countries panic as energy import bills surge, currencies weaken, and capital runs toward the dollar. Emerging markets crack first because they borrow in dollars, import energy, and have less policy room to absorb shocks. And when emerging markets crack, global demand weakens. Trade gets messy, risk rises again. A dark feedback loop starts running. Higher costs, political blame, export controls, retaliation, tighter supply, higher costs again. The worst part is this loop doesn't need a full-scale war to keep moving. It can run on policy alone, on licensing delays, on export control lists, on sanctions enforcement, on insurance repricing, on a single ship being held long enough to scare the entire market. That's why this crisis can accelerate so fast. Energy markets move in hours. Credit markets move in minutes. Supply chains move in days. Public anger moves instantly the moment people see prices at the pump. And here's the central point. If the U.S. has effectively threatened a discounted energy node China sees as industrially vital, Beijing won't respond emotionally. It will respond structurally, by turning interdependence into a weapon, by raising America's costs where it hurts most. Because in great power competition, the side that forces the other into exhaustion through cost and friction usually wins. In Part 2, we'll map the mechanics. Why even a partial Hormuz disruption can spike prices, how energy inflation can snap U.S. inflation back to life, and how a rare earth component squeeze can turn this into a true global stagflation risk. If you want to understand why this scenario is so dangerous that everyone would try to pull the brakes, you have to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in mechanics, not statements, not speeches, system behavior. Because markets and supply chains don't wait for proof. They react to probabilities. 1. Hormuz. You don't need a full closure. You only need a risk premium. Energy markets price two things, barrels and fear. A straight shutdown is rare, but you don't need it. You only need the conditions that make shipping unreliable. Threats that force insurers to reprice coverage. Enough naval tension to delay or reroute tankers. Enough uncertainty that traders start hoarding inventory just in case. Enough headlines that physical buyers panic and lock in supply early. That's how you get a price spike without a single pipeline being blown up. And here's the ugly truth. Oil is the fastest macro shock transmitter on Earth. It doesn't just hit gas stations. It hits everything that moves, everything that ships, everything that farms, everything that manufactures. Because oil isn't just fuel. Oil is transport costs. Oil is fertilizer and petrochemicals. Oil is plastics and packaging. Oil is diesel for harvest, freight for food, fuel for retail distribution. So when Hormuz gets threatened, the market doesn't ask, is it 100% closed? The market asks, how much more expensive is it to move one barrel next week? And that question alone is enough to push prices sharply higher. 2. Energy inflation is the most politically explosive inflation. There are two types of inflation the public tolerates differently. Demand inflation, people spending too much, feels abstract. Energy inflation feels like betrayal. When oil jumps, people don't argue about macro theory. They see it at the pump, immediately. They see it in food prices within weeks. They see it in shipping surcharges, repair bills, airline tickets, heating costs. And once households feel energy inflation returning, the psychological shift happens. They stop believing inflation is over. That belief is everything. Because when people believe inflation is back, behavior changes. Consumers pull forward purchases, buy now before it's worse. Businesses raise prices preemptively. Workers demand higher wages. Investors demand higher yields. That's not a normal cycle. That's how inflation becomes a regime. 3. This is where Trump's low-rates plan runs into the Fed's credibility wall. A low-rate political agenda only works if inflation is falling and stable. But if oil spikes and input costs surge, inflation expectations start lifting again. And once expectations lift, the Fed gets boxed in. Even if growth slows, even if unemployment rises, the Fed can't cut aggressively if it thinks inflation is re-accelerating, because if it cuts into a supply shock, it risks reigniting inflation, unanchoring expectations, losing bond market confidence. And here's the part most people miss. Markets can tighten even if the Fed doesn't hike. If investors believe inflation is returning, long-term yields rise anyway. Treasury yields climb, mortgage rates stay elevated, corporate borrowing costs rise, credit spreads widen, refinancing windows close. So the policy rate is not the whole story. Financial conditions can tighten on their own, and when they do, it hits the economy like a slow choke. That's the macro nightmare: weaker growth plus sticky inflation pressure, stagflation risk. 4. China's second lever. Rare earths and components turn inflation from energy shock into industrial shock. Now imagine the U.S. is dealing with higher oil and restricted industrial inputs at the same time. That's not additive, that's multiplicative. Why? Because modern manufacturing is upstream sensitive. A single missing component can freeze an entire line. A single material restriction can delay deliveries for months. A single licensing rule can create bottlenecks that ripple through multiple industries. Rare earths matter because they're deeply embedded in precision motors and magnets, electronics and sensors, defense and aerospace components, industrial machinery, EV and energy infrastructure supply chains. And even if the U.S. can substitute eventually, substitution is not instant. So what happens first? Companies hoard inventory, suppliers stretch lead times, buyers bid up prices for secured supply, production schedules slip, costs rise across the board. That's the cost-push inflation engine revving again, but now it's not just oil. It's the input layer of the industrial economy. 5. The dollar paradox kicks in, and emerging markets crack first. When global risk spikes, money doesn't flow to the most innocent country. It flows to the deepest pool of liquidity. That's the dollar. So even if the U.S. is part of the shock, capital often runs into the dollar during panic. That strengthens the dollar. And a stronger dollar does 3 brutal things. It makes dollar-denominated debt heavier for emerging markets. It forces EM central banks into ugly choices: hike rates or accept currency collapse. It widens credit spreads and shrinks refinancing windows. This is why emerging markets feel it first. Not because they started it, but because they're more funding sensitive. When their currencies weaken, imported energy becomes even more expensive. When energy gets more expensive, their inflation rises. When inflation rises, they hike rates. When they hike, growth slows. When growth slows, debt stress rises. And the global loop tightens again. 6. The system spiral. Policy retaliation becomes the engine that keeps the crisis alive. This is the part that turns a shock into a long crisis. Because once leaders feel trapped, they reach for tools that sound strong: export controls, sanctions enforcement, tariffs, inspections and seizures, restrictions on payments and logistics, pressure on insurers and shippers. Every tool raises friction. Every friction raises costs. Every cost increase creates more public anger. Every public anger creates more political incentive to escalate. That's the dark loop. Higher costs, political blame, export controls, retaliation, fragmentation, higher costs again. And once fragmentation becomes the baseline, inflation doesn't fully go away. It becomes sticky, because the system itself becomes permanently less efficient. 7. The key strategic point. Venezuela is the trigger, not the main theater. The war narrative is loud, but the economic narrative is what changes the world. Because the real fight isn't just about territory or leaders. It's about whether the global system stays integrated or breaks into hostile blocks. And if the U.S. normalizes coercion under certain framings, rivals learn something. Don't fight America directly. Make America pay through systems, through supply chains, through finance, through attrition, through political exhaustion. That's why this scenario is so dangerous. Not because it guarantees a world war, but because it makes de-escalation politically expensive and escalation structurally easy. In Part 3, I'll connect the final dots into a clear, early 2026 crash path. How this turns into a synchronized global slowdown, where the first breaks show up: credit, housing, small business, EM debt, and why a fast negotiation is the only clean exit, because otherwise the system itself becomes the battlefield. Now we connect everything into one coherent failure chain, the kind that doesn't look inevitable until it's already underway. Because the real danger here isn't one dramatic event. The real danger is momentum, a sequence where each step makes the next step more likely, and each actor gets trapped inside their own narrative. 1. The early 2026 crash path is not a single crash. It's a tightening cycle that spreads. Here's the path, simplified into a system story. Hormuz threat, oil spikes, inflation, expectations lift, yields rise, credit tightens, growth slows, political anger rises, retaliation accelerates, supply chains fragment, inflation stays sticky, central banks get trapped. That's not a headline. That's a machine. And once that machine starts running, it becomes very hard to stop because the incentives of every player point in the wrong direction. 2. Where the first cracks appear. Credit, not stocks. People always assume crises start in stock markets, but system crises usually start in credit because credit is the plumbing. When uncertainty rises, lenders don't need permission. They tighten automatically. Banks raise standards. Lenders demand more collateral. Spreads widen. Floating rate borrowers feel pain immediately. Refinancing windows shrink. The first victims aren't the flashy companies. They're the leverage-sensitive parts of the economy. Small businesses with short-term credit lines. Commercial real estate with refinancing cliffs. Debt-heavy households. Lower-rated corporate borrowers. Commodity-sensitive regions like rural America. This is how geopolitics becomes layoffs without a single shot fired near your city. 3. The inflation trap. Policymakers get boxed into the worst decision set. This is where the nightmare becomes real. If energy inflation rises and supply-side inflation returns, policymakers face a cruel menu. Cut rates, risk reigniting inflation and losing credibility. Hold rates, risk rising unemployment and debt stress. Subsidize, widen deficits and potentially prolong inflation. Escalate trade retaliation. Raise costs further. Back down, look weak politically and invite further pressure. In other words, every choice has a downside, and the political system tends to choose the option that avoids humiliation, not the option that minimizes long-term damage. That's why the best economic move is often politically impossible. 4. The global amplifier. The dollar squeezes the world even if the U.S. is the source of chaos. This is where the crisis stops being America's problem. If markets believe inflation is returning, yields rise. If yields rise, the dollar strengthens. If the dollar strengthens, emerging markets get hit. And emerging markets don't crack because they're poorly managed. They crack because the global system is still dollar-centered. A stronger dollar means higher debt service for dollar borrowers, imported inflation via energy and food, capital flight risk, forced rate hikes abroad, growth slowdowns abroad, political instability risk. That's how a Venezuela shock can trigger stress in places that have nothing to do with Venezuela at all. It's systemic contagion. 5. The supply scissors. Demand shock on one side, input shock on the other. This is the part that looks like a recession trap. Remember the two blades? Demand blade. Export disruptions, reduced trade flows, weaker global demand. Supply blade. Energy spikes, component shortages, logistics friction. A normal recession is demand-driven, prices fall, central banks cut, recovery begins. But a supply squeeze recession is nastier. Growth weakens while prices stay elevated. That's stagflation pressure, and it makes recovery slower and political anger sharper. 6. The political escalation loop. Once it becomes identity, it's hard to negotiate. This is the biggest reason crises metastasize. At the beginning, policy is negotiable. But as soon as leaders publicly frame things as existential, terror, sovereignty, aggression, national pride, standing strong. It becomes identity. And once it's identity, de-escalation isn't a strategy. It's a humiliation risk. That's how the latter builds itself without anyone formally choosing it. One seizure leads to retaliation. One sanction list leads to counter-sanctions. One shipping incident leads to an enforcement surge. One shortage leads to export restrictions. One domestic protest leads to harder rhetoric, and the system becomes permanently noisy. Noise is poison for investment. 7. Why the world pressures Washington. Because the hostage becomes a global inflation trigger. Here's the cold logic behind the world demanding release him. It's not necessarily sympathy for Venezuela. It's risk management. If Washington keeps the Venezuelan leader, it hardens the conflict narrative and keeps escalation probability high. And in energy markets, probability is enough to keep the premium elevated. So the world isn't reacting to moral arguments. It's reacting to cost of living. Because if oil stays high, Europe gets squeezed again. Asia's import bills surge. EM currencies weaken. Food inflation rises. Political unrest risk rises. Global growth slows. That's why everyone wants an off-ramp. 8. The strategic truth. China doesn't need to win. It only needs to prolong the squeeze. This is the most dangerous part of systems warfare. China doesn't need a dramatic move. It only needs to create a world where the U.S. bleeds attention, credibility, and economic stability. That means keeping input pressure high enough to raise costs, keeping trade tension high enough to suppress confidence, keeping the dollar strong enough to stress emerging markets, keeping the inflation narrative alive enough to box in the Fed, keeping political conflict loud enough to prevent clean compromise. And if the U.S. is perceived as stuck, rivals don't rush to end it. They quietly feed it. 9. The only clean exit. Fast negotiation before the system locks in. Once the insurance repricing happens, once shipping reroutes become normal, once export controls are embedded into compliance systems, reversing it is slow. The clean exit requires speed. A credible off-ramp in Venezuela, a de-escalation signal around Hormuz, an easing of component rare earth restrictions. A narrative reset that gives leaders political cover to step back. Because if leaders wait too long, the crisis stops being an event. It becomes the baseline. Closing, the real headline. The real headline isn't Hormuz. The real headline isn't Venezuela. The real headline is, interdependence is no longer stabilizing the world. It's weaponizing it. And once interdependence is weaponized, inflation becomes structural, politics becomes reactive, and crises stop being exceptions. They become the operating environment. That's why early 2026 doesn't need a single World War moment to feel like a global turning point. All it needs is a system that can't de-escalate, because every actor believes stepping back is weakness. And in that kind of world, the most dangerous thing isn't the first strike. It's the moment nobody can admit they need an exit.